Yesterday we were talking about free will. And I mentioned that freedom is freedom from outside compulsion, causation. The question is sometimes asked, does Hashem have free will? And here, I think, in order to answer it in an instructive way, a meaningful way, I have to be very careful to distinguish between free will and free choice. Free will, I'm not going back on what I said. Free will means that it's free from external compulsion. Free choice means I could have done something else. I chose one thing, but in the very same circumstances, at the same time, I could have chosen something else. Those two might not be always accompanying one another. Now, when you apply it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I think they come apart. Freedom from external compulsion. Freedom from external causation. Wow. Hashem has that in spades. Nothing causes Hashem. Nothing manipulates Hashem. Nothing forces Hashem. Nothing pushes Hashem. That's a no-brainer. It's beyond belief. But it doesn't follow necessarily that he could have done otherwise, because there might be something internal to Hashem that limits his choices. So, for example, I think I've never come across anyone who denies this, but I have know the whole literature. I think everyone that I've seen ever agrees that it's not possible for Hashem to do evil. God's goodness is a part of his perfection, and it's a necessary quality of it. Not just accidental that he's good. He might have been bad. It's necessary that he's good. That being the case, in some sense, God can't do evil. So when he does good, at least sometimes, on the one hand, it's true that he has no external causation. He's free from any external causation. In that sense that he's free. But in the other sense, that he could have done otherwise, isn't true. Because he's necessarily good. So, having said that, then the next question to ask is, well, why do we have, for us, both? We have freedom from external causation for free will, and we could have done otherwise. And why do we emphasize that? Why do we stress that? And we do. We do take it and stress it. And I think the right answer is this. When you think about free will for a human being, freedom from external causation, any and all external causation. That means freedom also from divine causation. It means that even Hashem's will didn't make him do it. Then the question arises, isn't Hashem's will running everything? I mean, isn't everything orchestrated by Hashem? Everything exists because of Hashem. He gives everything its existence moment by moment. How could there be anything that escapes divine causation? And that means, how could there then be free will for a human being if freedom means freedom from all external causation, including Hashem's external causation? How is that possible? And the answer to that question that the Torah gives, I'm not sure whether this is the only possible answer, but this is the answer that the Torah gives. Is that Hashem creates the world in such a way that a particular corner of the world isn't determined by his will. And here's how he does it. He creates a human being. Ramchal says this is the purpose of it. He creates a human being with two features, the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, a good inclination and an evil inclination. They are both motivations. They motivate the person to act, and often they conflict. So you have a motivation pushing him one way, a motivation pushing him the other way. Now, you could leave it like that, and then if one motivation is stronger than the other one, that will win, and that is what it will do. And if the two motivations are equal, then he becomes paralyzed. It doesn't do anything. Assuming that the good thing and the bad thing both require action. Then we wouldn't have been any different from squirrels. Squirrels may not have competing motivations, but it's purely mechanical what you do. But he didn't do that. He gave us a good inclination, an evil inclination, opposing motivations, and he gave us the third element by which one of the two is chosen to be the one that will guide the action. That's called the free will. God creates the free will. He sustains its existence. But by its very definition, the thing that God is creating is something that operates on its own. And that sounds questionable to you. If it sounds intuitively questionable because, how could something escape God's power and God's influence and God's activity, I'm going to offer you an opposite intuition, which may loosen up your mind a little bit. You want to say there can't be anything that escapes God's management and God's causation? You mean God can't create something that operates on its own? Really, why do you think God can't do that? Why would you think you could limit God's power and say, well, he can move mountains all right, but this he can't do? Why not? What is it that's stopping him from doing it? So our sources say that that's precisely what he does. He creates that third factor, the free will, as something which operates on its own. And then it makes the decision. And I'll give you an analogy. Again, to try to loosen up your intuition. We say twice in the morning, after Baruch Hu, that Hashem is Mechadesh Ma'aseh Bereishis, continuously. He's remaking the world, moment by moment. The Ramchal, in an essay called Ma'amar al Chochmah, in one of its editions, there are several editions, in one of his editions, the Ramchal asks the question, why does Hashem continuously remake the world? Why is he pouring in extra divine energy continuously to keep the world in existence? Why is he doing that? And Ramchal says explicitly, he doesn't have to do that. He could make the world to exist on its own. He's all powerful. Nothing would stop him from doing that. So, since he could do it, you have to ask, why he didn't do that? The answer that the Ramchal gives, I think, is really astonishing. He says the reason is spiritual. Because the whole purpose of a person's existence is to be dovek, to be attached to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And to be attached, he's got to be available. And he makes himself available by his will supporting the existence of everything that exists, so that his will and activity are manifest in the table and in the clouds and in the stars. For the sake of being able to have dveikus with Hashem, he recreates the world continuously. But it didn't have to be that way. So just like the Ramchal says explicitly that Hashem could create something that would exist on its own, so we say Hashem creates something that acts on its own. Well, the one is something that could have happened, and the other is something that did happen. And I think, by the way, that in one case it's true that he did do this. He did create something that exists on its own. What I'm going to tell you now is a speculation of my own, but I have tried it out on Talmidei Chachamim, and they tend to agree with me. If a person performs an action and later is held responsible for it, either to reward him or punish him, it has to be the same person. It can't be something that's made later that just looks like him. That wouldn't be morally appropriate. Especially punishment wouldn't be morally appropriate. So maybe this table is being recreated moment by moment. But the human soul, which is going to be held responsible for its actions, the human soul better not be recreated moment by moment. Because later on it won't be the same soul. So I think this idea of creating something which then continues to exist without being recreated is something that Kodesh Baruch Hu did with respect to the soul. Just didn't do it with respect to the entire rest of the universe. And Mechadish would be exclusive of the soul. At any rate, this now, I hope, loosens up your intuitions. Now the question is, why? So the idea that we could do something else is the solution to an engineering problem. The definition of free will is not the capability of making other choices. Because Baruch Hu, we are saying, has free will, and he isn't capable of making other choices. Because his internal nature dictates which choice should be made. And since he's perfect, maybe you shouldn't call it a choice, which thing should be done. And since he's perfect, so then his perfect nature dictates the perfect thing to be done. So he's free, but doesn't have the possibility of doing otherwise. For us, the possibility of doing otherwise is the way we become free of divine causation. It's an engineering solution. How can you make something which isn't, what it does isn't determined by God's will, since his will is running everything. So he's got to, with his will, make something which isn't running by his will. But of course, if he's all powerful, there's no reason why he can't do that. There's no inherent contradiction in doing something like that. So that's what he does. So in the end, we can do otherwise, and he cannot do otherwise. And yet, his will is free, because freedom doesn't mean you can do otherwise. Freedom means that you're free from external causation. And then this has very far-reaching consequences. So, for example, can Hashem guarantee that a person won't do transgressions and will do mitzvos? Well, he could certainly cause his body to move to put on tefillin, and he could certainly cause the cheeseburger that he just bought to evaporate. He could still do that. But Hashem causing his body to move to put on tefillin isn't the person performing the mitzvah of tefillin. He's just become a tool in the hands of a manipulator. The same with the cheeseburger. So Hashem can command, and we know what Hashem prefers, but whether or not the mitzvah will be done is up to the free will of the person. He can't cause it, because if it's caused, it's not free. That's a contradiction. That's a real line in the sand. Okay, so that's the idea of the freedom that we have, and the freedom that Kodesh Baruch Hu has. I think that's emes. Now, the problem that I wanted to raise today is a classical problem in Jewish sources, and lahavdil is a classical problem in general philosophy, and that is, if Hashem knows the future, can we choose Is it possible for us to choose? I think of myself today making a choice. I got two alternatives, A and B. I'm considering which one. I've made up my mind, but time's running out. I'll have to choose one. I think, well, listen, I could do A. Here are the good points and losses in A. Here are the good points and losses in B. I figure it up, and I say, okay, I'll do B. To me, feels like I could have done either one up to the very last minute. And what determined that B would happen and not A is that I chose it. But otherwise, they were both in my hands. Both possible for me. Now, let's imagine a critic who says, Rabbi, you believe in God? And I say, look at this coat. I wouldn't wear this coat if I didn't believe in God. And then he says, well, you believe that God knows everything? Sure. You believe that God knew everything even yesterday? Sure. Time doesn't make any difference to him. Well, did he know yesterday that you're going to choose B? Yeah, sure. He knew everything, so he knew that also. Well, then, could you really have done A? Hello, Rabbi. Think about that. What would it mean for you today to do A? Wouldn't that mean that you're doing A today would contradict God's knowledge yesterday? Contradict God's knowledge? Is that really possible? For you to do something that would contradict God's knowledge? Isn't God's knowledge infallible, perfect, necessary? So how could you think that you have the possibility of doing A today? That's the right way to put the problem. There were some struggles in 20th century philosophy to put the problem correctly. It's that way in the Rambam. Had they deigned to look into the Rambam, they would have found it right away. And it took them a couple of decades. Nelson Pike was one of the people who got it right. So you feel sort of trapped. If free will for a human being means the ability to choose between alternatives, well, I did B, but since I did B, then yesterday God knew that I was going to do B. And if yesterday he already knew I was going to do B, it doesn't seem like I could have done A. So I don't really have any alternatives. And if you're telling me that for a human being, freedom requires the ability to do something other than you did, it's falling apart. There really isn't the ability to do something other than you did. God's knowledge, in particular his foreknowledge, contradicts the ability to have a free choice. That's the problem. Now, there are two responses to the problem in the literature, and I should remark because there are a lot of old recordings of mine, and I can't manage these things. I'm just not. I used to think there were four approaches, and I taught them, and I put it on the blackboard, the whole thing. And about 10 years ago, I read a tshuva of the Rivash, and I realized I was making mistakes. And I think now that I'm just saying what the Rivash says, what I think is a much, much better explanation. There are really two approaches, only two approaches. One approach is to try to answer the argument, to answer the question, how could it be possible? I'll show you how it will be possible. And the other is to escape the whole problem by saying that it's based on a false premise. The first way of handling it is from Rav Saadia Gaon and the Keres Yitzchak and the Rivash, and a few others. And the second way is the Rambam. But today I will describe the first way, then Yis Hashem tomorrow let's describe the second way. When we put this argument that if he knew yesterday, I can't do anything else today, there was a certain point in the argument where we made an assumption. And the assumption was under the table. We didn't mention it. But if I pull it out and put it on top of the table where you can see it, then you see that maybe we could deny that assumption and avoid the argument. So let's go through it again. I'll go through it again with slightly more detail this time. What really happened? What really happened was that I chose B, and Hashem knew yesterday that I was going to choose B. That's what really happened. Now, we're thinking about hypothetical, something that didn't happen. Could I have done A? And what would have happened had I done A? What would the world have been like? It would have been reasonable, or would it maybe contain a contradiction? In other words, we're not thinking about actual history. We're thinking about an alternative that isn't true, and wondering whether that alternative can be described in a way that makes sense. So we start by saying, well, imagine that I did A, which I didn't, but imagine. So now we're describing an imaginary world. Let's see now. What's that imaginary world like? Well, in that imaginary world, yesterday, God knew I was going to do B. And then, my doing A in a world which he knew I was going to do B is a contradiction, so the thing falls apart. Wait a minute. When we move to that imaginary world where I do A, who says what God knew yesterday in that world? Where'd you get that from? We're not talking about the real world. We're talking about the imaginary world. You start by saying, in that imaginary world, I do A. Okay, that's what we're talking about. We want to see whether that's possible. And then you fill in what God knew yesterday in that imaginary world. And then you make trouble. Who told you how to fill it in? Maybe, try this on for size. Maybe, in that world, yesterday, he knew A. Just as you changed what I did, change also what he knew. And the imaginary world is one in which I do A, and God knew yesterday I would do A. There's no problem at all. You cheated. You imagined a world in which I did A, and then you snuck in that for yesterday in that world God knew I was going to do B. That's how you created your problem. Who gave you the right to do that? Indeed, maybe the way we should think about God's knowledge is perfect because it tracks every fact that happens perfectly. God's knowledge tracks every fact that happens perfectly. Okay, so in our world, I do B, and his knowledge tracks that I do B. In that imaginary world, where I do A, God's knowledge tracks that perfectly, and his knowledge is that I do A. And then there's no problem at all. Another way of putting this, by the way, Bertrand Russell was no friend of ours. He was a very loudly pronounced atheist. He was proud of it. And he was a great philosopher and mathematician. Said, don't try to beat up the believer with this problem, because when you talk about God yesterday, knowing what I'm going to do today, you didn't explain how he knows. And here I've got a suggestion for you, or for the believer. Let's say that yesterday, he knows what we're going to do today because God yesterday takes a peek at tomorrow, what's tomorrow for him, and sees it. He watches it. And that's how he knows. So in our world, where I do B, yesterday God, so to speak, looks at the future and sees me doing B, and that's how he knows I'm doing B. And in that imaginary world, where I do A, God yesterday looks at today from yesterday, sees me doing A, and that world knows that I'm doing A. And then you have no contradiction. Indeed, I can give you a model of how this works in terms of our way of thinking about how God relates to the world. Just a little more detail, which might help fill out the picture for you. We said a few days ago that Hashem has like two dimensions in which he relates to us. In one dimension, he's above, beyond, transcendent, and in particular, he's the creator of the whole universe. And the other dimension, he's present in some sense throughout the universe. It's called Masabiv Kol Almin, Mamali Kol Almin in the technical literature. So imagine, here I am today in our world doing B. Well, he's here. His will is here. His will is manifesting itself by creating everything. So he's, so to speak, present in my doing of B. Okay, but now, also, he's above our world. He's the creator of our world. So he transcends our whole world. This knowledge that is picked up by being part of my doing B is now available outside and superior to the entire creation. And that's step 2. And then from that outside position, it becomes available to his presence at every other time and place, including yesterday. So first I do B here and now, and Hashem, so to speak, is here and now in that. Secondly, that knowledge is passed up to the transcendent. And from there it's passed down to the immanent everywhere, including yesterday. That's how it happens. Well, if that's how it happens in our world, it'll happen exactly the same way in the imaginary world. In the imaginary world today I do A. God is present in my doing A, so the knowledge of doing A is possessed by him. Then it's passed up beyond the world and then made available to yesterday. And that's how in that world, yesterday he knows that I do A. And then there's no contradiction at all. The whole problem was based on a false assumption built into the logic. And once you identify that false assumption and correct it, the problem goes away. Now, I told you that the Rambam doesn't agree to this. He doesn't agree to this because it pictures Hashem's relationship to the world in a way that the Rambam objects to. As far as I can tell, those who accept it disagree with the Rambam's picture. Rambam's picture is radical in a certain sense, absolute in a certain sense, and others wouldn't necessarily see it that way. The feature of Hashem's relationship to the world that the Rambam is emphasizing is this, that Hashem and everything about Hashem and everything in Hashem, so to speak, is totally independent of the world. Eino mispoel klal, says in Hebrew. He's not acted upon in any way. Nothing that happens has any effect on him. He is what he is, internally, exists necessarily, and changelessly. In the first section of the Guide of the Perplexed, the Rambam says this about 6 times. Sometimes he says the reason that he rejects any acted upon is because it would imply a change. So if something happens in the world, let's say, and you describe Hashem as being angry over it or getting angry over it, then you're saying before he wasn't angry and now he is angry, and that's ridiculous. Hashem doesn't change. But sometimes he says it without emphasizing change. It's just not correct to describe anything in the world being the source of something in Hashem. The flow between Hashem and the world is a one-way flow. It's from him to the world. There are no changes and no receptivity. It's all flow outward. So if that's the case, this idea that he gets his knowledge from what happens in the world, for the Rambam, is absolutely unacceptable. Remember, one word that I used was tracking. His knowledge tracks what happens. That means it happens, and then he tracks it, and then tracking it, he gets the knowledge from what happens. The Rambam is not going to accept that. He's not going to allow that God has acted upon anything outside of him altogether. And in fact, in part 3, chapter 17 of the Gemara, when the Rambam is reviewing Arabic philosophy, and he describes one school of Arabic philosophy as holding the position that God knows everything, and also holding the position that that we have free will. And he says, a little thought will show you that that's an absolute contradiction. So the Rambam's on record that solving this problem is not possible. And although he discusses the problem in the Torah in detail, and we'll talk about that in Hashem tomorrow, he talks about it in detail, one must understand that what he says there isn't a solution. It doesn't dissolve the argument the way I dissolved it before, where those sources dissolved it before. No, he has an attitude towards the problem which is entirely separate, entirely different. So, according to this way of looking at it, the problem was a phony problem based on an extra premise. Now, I want to go back and talk about this formulation of the problem, because sometimes people say it in different words, and then it sounds like the problem hasn't been addressed, and I think those words are not correct. Let's go back to the idea. I made a decision between A and B. I was considering each one. I decided on B. And then when you say yesterday, God knew that I was going to do B. I couldn't do A, so I feel trapped. I feel trapped into doing B. Why am I trapped into doing B? I'm trapped because there's nothing else I can do. I'm not trapped because God's knowledge that I will do B forces me to do B, pushes me to do B, causes me to do B. No, that's not why. God's not involved in my decision at all. He's not making me do it. He's simply depriving me of any alternative. That's not the same as pushing and forcing. I did it on my own. For those who know philosophy, Harry Frankfurt is waving an arm here. I did it on my own. So it's not that he made me do it, it's rather that he cut off any other alternative. It's sort of like you put a person in a room, and there are two doors, and you tell them, well, I want you out of here in an hour, and I'm just letting you know that this door is locked and this door is open. Unlocked. So you say, well, okay, there are two doors, but I've only got one way to go, out the unlocked one. He didn't push me out the unlocked one. He didn't put me a gun to my head and force me to go out the unlocked one, but he made it sure that I'm only going out the unlocked one because that's the only one I can get out. That's the problem of God's knowledge. It doesn't picture God as active at all. It just pictures him as knowing. And that being the case, it just cuts off the other alternative. And if you say, well, but Rabbi, God doesn't only know, God also acts. So we talked about that in the first half of today. He acts, but he acts in such a way that this particular piece of the world, his action is to create it and maintain it in such a way that it can make its own decision. So that's the way to solve the problem. The problem was, there seems to be an argument deprives you of free will, and the solution is, the argument isn't a good argument. The Rambam is taking a position of dissolving the problem. Now, I'll just give an introduction now. We'll do it again tomorrow in more detail. The problem is really a collision between two things that we want to believe. One is that we have free will, and the other is that God has foreknowledge. You only have a collision if you believe both of them. Suppose you still were told that one of them isn't true, then you wouldn't have a collision. The Rambam's attitude is, it's not true to say that God knows. Wow, Rabbi, are you sure that you mean what you're saying? God doesn't know? How can you say that? Isn't God omniscient? I mean, isn't God omniscient by all definitions? And isn't it that if you say he doesn't know, that you're saying that he's ignorant? So here comes the first surprise. No, it isn't, because I'm going to say it isn't right to say he knows, and I'm going to say it isn't right to say he's ignorant either. Both of them are wrong. Both of them are wrong, Rabbi. What do you mean? I mean, if you don't know, then you're ignorant, right? I mean, how could you say that he doesn't know and he's not ignorant? So I'll give you an alternative. I'll give you an example. What would you say about a stone wall? Does a stone wall know things? I hope you say no. I hope that the fanciful, foolish imagination of some people who call themselves philosophers, who are now talking about the private thoughts of plants, haven't misled you so far as to think that stone walls know things. Okay, so stone walls don't have knowledge. Are they ignorant? Would it be appropriate to describe a stone wall as ignorant? I don't know. I don't think so. Certain things just escape your description. Same thing with vice and virtue. Certainly you're not going to tell me the stone wall is virtuous. But would you then thereby say the stone wall is vicious? I don't think so. Just stone walls don't count. They just don't count because things like virtue and vice, or things like knowledge and ignorance, don't apply to them altogether. The Rambam's position is that everything we say doesn't apply to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. So when I refuse to describe a Kodesh Baruch Hu as knowing, that doesn't mean I have to describe him as ignorant. I can't describe him as knowing, and I can't describe him as ignorant, because neither of them apply to him, because he's beyond all human description altogether. I'll give you another example. How about the number 6? The number 6. Twice 3. 3 times 2. 7 minus 1. Does the number 6 know anything? I don't think so. Numbers don't know anything. And they're not ignorant either. They're also outside the pale. They're also outside the field. And the words that we are talking about don't apply to them. Certain things occupy a certain position, and then we have words, and sometimes certain types of words don't apply to certain things in certain positions. None of them. What color is the number 6? I know, magenta, turquoise, lavender? Maybe not. Maybe not. Oh, then it's got to be transparent, Rabbi, because what's the only alternative? No, it's not transparent either. Color words just don't apply to numbers. They don't apply. So the bottom line here is Hashem isn't like anything that we know. So all our words and all our concepts don't apply to him. So that being the case, we aren't going to say he knows. So now let's go back to the problem. The problem was, he knew yesterday what I will do, and I have a free choice today. We're now going to deny that he knew yesterday what I will do, not because he's ignorant of it, though there are such opinions, but they're not ours. Maybe there's one or two, but the vast majority of our tradition denies that. But because speaking about him in terms of knowledge and ignorance is incompetent speech. It's the wrong thing to say. So the problem can't be raised. Not that the problem is solved, the problem can't be raised. Well, the leftover investigation, and this we'll have to talk about tomorrow, is what about all of the descriptions of Hashem that we have in our literature? Thousands of descriptions in the 1,000 pages of Tanakh and in all of the oral literature that we have. There are many, many, many descriptions of Hashem. What's going to be with all that literature if you can't talk about Hashem? It seems like we talk about Hashem all the time. The answer has to be, there is a way of talking about Hashem. In a certain sense, we'll see it really is about Hashem. But it's not this kind of way. It's not the kind of way that you would need to say he knows or is ignorant. That kind of way is off limits. And this kind of way is okay. And when you look at this kind of way, which we allow in talking about Hashem, the problem can't be raised. The problem could only be raised if you talk in the forbidden way, and that we can't do. And the headline of the different ways is, we can talk about what he does, we can't talk about what he is. We could talk about his actions, but not about his essence. In order to raise the problem, you have to be talking about his essence, that he knows. Talking about his actions won't be enough to raise the problem. And if you feel uncomfortable with that kind of limitation, that we can only talk about what he does, not what he is, I would recommend you to take another good look at the simplest fundamental science, where this goes on all the time. We have light in quantum mechanics. We can describe in very good terms what it does, and we don't have any account of what it is. Bertrand Russell, the fellow I mentioned before, points out that when you think about the fundamental particles of the world, and you speak of their properties, all we get is what they do. Electrons. Electrons are negatively charged. That means when you try to push them together, it gets harder and harder. The closer they get, the more effort you have to put in to push them together. That's what they do. They have a certain mass. That means when you try to make them move, you have to use a certain amount of energy to make them move. That's what they do. They have a certain spin. That means when you bounce something off of them, it doesn't bounce straight back. It bounces off at an angle. That's what they do. All we know about those building blocks of the universe are what they do. Nobody cries foul for elementary science for that. So there's no question that we're often in a situation of knowing what something does without knowing what it is. And from this point of view, that's exactly the position we're in with respect to Kodesh Baruch Hu. We can describe what he does because he told us. And it's describable and understandable, but we can't describe what he is. That's the key to the problem of foreknowledge of free will with the Rambam, and we will continue this in Yeshivat Hashem tomorrow.